Well, I think it's time for us to get started. Welcome to the ABS Education Committee Mid-Year Workshop, Lessons from Online Teaching and Learning Animal Behavior. Our workshop organizers and speakers today, Eduardo Bessa, Andrea Bierma, Daniel Rubenstein, and myself, Doug Wacker. So if you see us in the chat, if you have any questions or concerns or anything, you can give us a quick message and we'll talk to you. So this may look familiar to some of you. Even if you haven't taught using Zoom, I think we've all been in enough Zoom meetings to kind of recognize these dreaded black boxes. Right? And how do we deal with that, right? I know when I begin my online classes, when I was kind of thrust into this online environment in spring of 2020 with the COVID-19 pandemic, moving my classes from in-person to fully online, I hadn't done this before. In fact, when I start my classes now, I always ask this question: hello? Can everyone hear me? And you think about that, right? How many times have you had to ask that in an in-person class? Probably never, right? These are really extraordinary times. And we have a couple purposes in this workshop today. One is to share some ideas, some tips, some tricks that we've learned over the last year to make teaching and learning in the online environment more effective. So this isn't maybe your normal teaching and learning in the online environment workshop. Rather, we're doing this as a response to the fact that we've all kind of been pushed into this environment. However, a second goal of this workshop is to see what we can take from what we've learned this year in the online environment and bring it back to our in-person class. So we want to think about that as we move forward today. Here's our schedule of events today. We'll have kind of the same general organization. There'll be some talks, 15 minutes by the organizers. Then we'll have some videos that we can watch that were shared by participants. And then we will move into breakout rooms for about 15 minutes where we'll be able to discuss what we've seen and what we've heard, and then some of our own experiences and how they may help others kind of adapt to this online environment. Then we'll come back from those breakout rooms and have kind of a general discussion before we move on to the next topic. So we have a few main topics today: teaching online lectures and discussions, field exercises to courses, how to make the virtual real, digital resources, searching the web, and finally, digital assessment, depth, breadth, and fairness. And then finally, we'll have a kind of an end conversation in the closing session about what to take from 2020 into your class, both now and then in the future when we get back into the in-person environment. All right. So I'm going to start with the first topic today. And that's teaching online lectures and discussions. So again, my name's Doug Wacker. I'm an assistant professor of animal behavior at the University of Washington, Bothell. Bothell is a small satellite campus of the larger University of Washington system. We're primarily an undergraduate institution. I had some help putting together this material today from John Robertson, the Associate Dean for Instructional Design and Emerging Technologies from Seattle Pacific University. So when we were first kind of before that, let me tell you, these are the classes I teach. I teach 5 classes a year. Basically anything that has the word behavior in it, I teach at my university. And I've had an opportunity to teach these classes both in person now, and I've taught them all online. So when I moved from the in-person to the online environment, I had to deal with this question. We all had to deal with this question: to be or not to be, synchronous or asynchronous, or partially synchronous. And of course, Hamlet was talking about life and death, and this question isn't so grave, I suppose, but it did keep me up at night a couple of times, kind of wrestling with what percentage of synchronous versus asynchronous will my classes be. And ultimately, I went with this kind of partially synchronous model where I present some material at the beginning of the week online for my students, recorded lecture videos, readings, etc. And then we would meet in person over Zoom in that second part of our week and discuss that material and do some activities. So it's kind of like a flipped classroom. So once I figured that out, I had to deal with some equity issues. And these are things that I think are incredibly important, especially in the online environment. And of course, we've all seen these kind of diagrammatic representations of equality versus equity online before. This is one of my favorites. Equality, meaning that you're just giving all your students the same thing, and equitable access, meaning you're giving your students what they need to succeed, right? And when working in the online environment, we have to think about equitable access to a number of different things. So equitable access to technology. Do your students all have computers? Hopefully, right? But they may not all have a web camera, right? If your expectation is for them to participate in kind of discussions with their cameras on, this is something that you need to consider. Do your students have access to adequate high-speed internet? I know some of my students had trouble where they kind of clip in and out with their audio and so forth. And these are things you have to deal with. And luckily, my university kind of takes care of these first two things if students need them, but your university may or may not. It's a question worth asking before you begin a quarter of online teaching and learning. Do your students have equitable access to physical materials, including textbooks? Is your bookstore even open? Ours has been closed for a long time. And then finally, equitable access to required class activities. And this is something that didn't even occur to me. So I have my students in my animal behavior class go to the zoo and complete an ethogram. Our zoo has all these outdoor exhibits. They have all these safety protocols set up. And I went there. I felt fairly comfortable having my students go and complete this project, even during the pandemic. However, not all of my students have cars. This didn't even occur to me. And if they couldn't get a ride, they'd have to take public transit to the zoo, which they may or may not feel comfortable doing in these times. So these are things that perhaps we would never even have to think of in normal times, but we need to consider, need to think about them, but we need to think about them more, I think, in the online environment. Okay, so once we figure out how we're going to teach our class and we talk about, we've kind of thought about our equity issues, I want to talk about now some of the problems that I ran into teaching and how I kind of solved them. It's not perfect, and these are not kind of any grand ideas, but they help me, and there are things I wish I would have known before I got started, so maybe they'll help you too. So the first problem is those infinite black boxes. How do you connect if you can't see your students' faces or reactions? It's a big problem, right? And one thing that I did, like the simplest solution really was the one that worked the best. And that was simply asking my students if they felt comfortable to turn on their video cameras. And I just did this the other day when I started my behavioral neuroscience classes, and it went from about 3 students to about 12 students that flipped on their cameras in a 24-person class. And one thing I did is I told them why it was important. And I tried to weave in animal behavior a little bit. I said, as animals or people move through their external environment, as they can use multiple sensory modalities to gather information, they're going to be more successful. And I said, as an instructor, I'm more successful if I can look at your faces and kind of gauge your comprehension a little bit. If it's a black screen, I don't even know if you're there, right? And this, I think, resonates with students if you tell them why you want them to do something. But again, you need to respect privacy and equity issues. Sometimes students don't have access to a webcam, but maybe they don't want to show their surroundings, right? And also, if not everybody's webcam is on, you have to make sure you're still paying attention to those black boxes, because you're only getting a subset of people that you're interacting with visually, right? So you have to make sure you're paying attention to everyone in the classroom. If not a video, I ask folks to put up a photo. If not a photo, at least display their names. And this is all to keep it student focused, right? Content is not the biggest issue in the online environment. It's interactions with students that is more problematic. So trying to keep the class student focused has helped me. So the next problem is the anyone problem. This is Ben Stein from Ferris Bueller's Day Off. He just finished a passive lecture and then asked questions and got no responses. How can you make your online recorded lectures engaging and interactive? So I had colleagues that had real trouble with students watching those recorded videos that they spent so much time making and then coming to those synchronous portions of their class not ready for those kind of interactive discussions. And I kind of bumbled into a solution to this that really has worked for me. I simply make watching those videos worth a few points, and it's just a few points, 5 points here, 5 points there in the class. And I did this initially as just a very low stakes way for students to increase their grades. You know, we felt like at UW-Bothell that we needed to give students a little extra support during the pandemic and wanted to build their confidence. So I thought, what's an easy way to give them some points so they're not so worried about, you know, online testing or something. And I made these videos worth a few points. I was able to monitor the video watching with Panopto. That's maybe using a different program, but that one's nice because it integrates with a lot of education management tools. And I'm able to see what videos they're watching and for how long. And I'm not doing this to police the students, but rather just to give them an opportunity for a few more points. And they came to my synchronous components prepared and ready to discuss the material, where some of my colleagues had problems with that. So it really helped. I engage students with short content specific chunks. That's something we all know in the literature is the most effective in delivering material to students in short chunks and then having some kind of, you know, interactive activity between them. But, you know, when I first started doing this, I just started recording these hour-long lectures. And of course, they're incredibly passive because there's nobody else there with you. You're recording them, right? So this is especially important. So how do you make those engaging? Well, make them shorter so the students can digest them. But also, I give them worksheets to complete as they're watching the video to engage them in a different way, writing or typing in different spots of the video to kind of highlight principles as they move through. And then this feels really weird, but I also ask questions during the video. I'm a very interactive lecturer. This is different, kind of delivering content today that we'll talk about in the breakout rooms, but I'm constantly asking my students questions. When I first started recording these lectures, I wasn't doing that at all, and it felt very awkward. So I just started actually asking the questions to myself and pausing, and then telling my students we're going to address those questions in the synchronous portion of the class later in the week, and it worked quite well. The final problem is the breakout problem. How do you facilitate discussion in the online environment? We've got all these faces in the rectangles here. And I'll talk about the asynchronous component, then the synchronous component, and how I approach this problem. So for the asynchronous component, I use online discussion forums. You can do that in Canvas. You could do it in Discord, or we'll hear more about other online tools that you can use later today in one of our videos. And I have students post questions or comments about the material that they are responsible for. The first post, I usually just have students introduce themselves, and I ask them a question about themselves, again, to kind of keep the student focused. A great question that John Robertson, who worked with me on these slides, thought of was, or discussed was, what's the origin of your name? Kind of a not culturally biased question that really gets students talking about themselves. And then when the class starts and they're actually, you know, writing comments or questions based on the content, I always make them write a unique post, which makes them read the other posts that are up there. Now, that won't work if you've got like a 60 or 100 person class, but certainly works in the smaller classroom. And I allow students to respond to one another, not only to build interaction between myself and the students, but between the students in the class, which again is lacking sometimes in the online environment. In the synchronous portion of my classes, I do a couple of things. I allow students to participate in multiple ways. This is super important. There are students that just simply do not feel comfortable flipping that camera on, no matter what you ask, right? And that's fine. They may not feel comfortable talking into the microphone. Some students do. But just letting them participate via text chat. I've used shared Google Documents to build kind of community documents that we can use throughout the class. have been helpful ways to get students that are reluctant to participate on camera to invest in the class. And then finally, I have my students lead an online discussion. So I want to end with an activity that I use in the online classroom that maybe you could try as well. And leading a discussion, students leading a discussion, what does that entail? I have all students in my class read a primary research paper made available online. So all the students in the class are reading each of these papers. We do about 6 of these over the course of a quarter. I assign students to small groups. 4 to 6 students works best in my experience, depends on your class size, to lead 60-minute online discussions. Our classes are 2 hours long, so half of a class for us. And I emphasize to my students that leading a discussion is very different from simply presenting information. So what does leading a discussion entail? Well, there's some preparation that goes into this. I demonstrate the first discussion to help them know what my expectations are. I discuss question types with the students using Bloom's taxonomy. Students haven't seen this before sometimes. They don't know the difference. They initially just want to ask yes or no questions. They don't understand what maybe an evaluative question is. So just introducing them to these concepts helps them. The groups, the discussion leaders will hold their own Zoom meetings to organize and prepare. I always make myself available for those if they'd like me to come in. And non-presenters submit written comments on those online discussion boards the day before the discussion. The leaders can then use these questions to propel the discussion on the day that it occurs. So there's students that can interact with. So during the discussion, leaders share their screen to display background information, paper figures, etc., but it's not a presentation. Each student presents, but also asks numerous questions about their paper selection. And they get feedback from those or responses from those other students in the class who are not leading the discussion. One student usually advances the slides, like on Google Slides, while another student looks for questions in the chat, looks at participant hands, and that's a way to manage that. It's interesting, the whole hand raising in Zoom. One thing that we found that's interesting is that you get a lot of people with their hands up, and when people get to asking those questions, you're getting old topics at the top. Sometimes it's better to actually call on people at the bottom who have just raised their hand, because in the classroom, someone might make present an idea, and then you'll see a hand shoot up. Then to call on them next. But in the participant tab, it's kind of chronological, and you have to be careful in Zoom, at least, in dealing with that. And then I grade my students on equal participation, background preparation, thorough understanding of the paper, visual aids. They use audio, video, share their screen just like this, flow, and especially the ability to facilitate discussion. So I actually grade the students on their ability to get other students talking. Again, bring in animal behavior concepts. I talk about reciprocal altruism. I say, hey, if you want people to participate in your discussion, you're going to need to participate in theirs. And we have a big discussion about that. So all of these things fit really well in the online environment, but I think you all can see how this would also fit in the in-person environment as well. So I'm really excited about kind of porting this activity into kind of the in-person classroom moving forward once we get back to teaching our students. So with that, thank you. I threw a lot of information out at you. Hopefully some of this information is helpful. I realize it's kind of basic, but again, it's stuff that I wish I would have known when I got started. And let's see, I think we're going to jump forward now. We have a couple of videos that we're going to show from participants about this topic, teaching online lectures and discussions. So I'm going to stop sharing if you want to queue up those videos.
Hello, everybody. I'm Dan Rubenstein. I'm going to try now to share my screen and bring up the first video.
Hi, my name is Jennifer Kovacs. I'm an associate professor of biology at
Can everyone see it?
College. This past semester, I taught a behavioral ecology course for upper level biology majors. So I included a larger guest speaker component into my course than I normally do. What I did this semester and will continue to do going forward is to have students read a paper that the speaker wrote or the speaker recommends and suggests that the students read, and then came to class and we workshopped questions as a class. So the way this worked was I had students go into small breakout rooms and with a partner write 4 or 5 questions that they wanted to ask. So students had access to the scientific paper, the scientific literature, as well as the speaker's webpage or social media, YouTube videos, other things that the speakers suggested and recommended about themselves. And students had watched that, seen those things before they came to class. And then in their small groups, 4 or 5 questions about the science in the paper, about the speakers, how their speaker science worked with their textbook and topics and case studies we've been discussing in class and in lab, as well as with the research project. Students were doing a behavioral research project on foraging and giving up density in particular. And so most of the invited speakers, their research centered on those ideas. So it was really relevant to the research that they were currently doing in the class throughout the course of the semester. And then they could also ask questions about the speaker themselves and their career path and what they were doing. And once students had written about those 4 or 5 questions, we came back as a class. They swapped between groups. They improved the questions there, and then we met back together as a larger class. This class had about 15 students, so I imagine this could be scaled up pretty easily. They came back together, and we talked about, which questions worked, which questions might not work, which ones were similar, what kinds of topics were coming up. I assigned pairs of students to host the speaker, and we gave those questions to the host. And to make question and answer time on Zoom a little more productive and a little less, interrupty, the host actually introduced the speaker. They met with the speaker briefly before the speaker came to talk during our lab period. So it gave them, 10, 15 minutes to sort of meet with the speaker while we were doing businessy stuff, the rest of us. So they had their own little breakout room. They introduced the speaker to the group. The speaker gave their talk, and then the host had that list of questions that they wanted to ask, and they did the Q&A with the speaker, which worked really well. The students really liked that. And so the students who were the hosts were actually the ones that got to choose which questions got asked and to make any changes that they wanted to make. Of course, also a lot of that depended on what the speaker talked about too, right? So they were able to modify that a little bit as they needed to. And then obviously the floor got opened up to the rest of the class if there were any other questions that they wanted to ask. Once the speaker left, we took a small break, and then we came back and really talked about what questions were good, what questions hit, which questions kind of struck out, and maybe why that was, right? And was there a better way to phrase a question, or was there a missed opportunity there, right? And really thinking about it. And I will say, I noticed just crazy progression of how well this worked over the semester. And the students got much, much better at asking questions and asked just really amazing questions. And I will say that one of the things that came out of the feedback from this was that students felt a lot more confident about going into grad school interviews. A lot of the students were seniors going into job interviews and grad school interviews because they were kind of honing questions for that. They started to do that. They said, oh, now I've got a list of questions that when I go in and I talk to people and for my grad school interviews, I've got questions, because they figured out kind of what questions they could ask multiple times, right? So sort of making these really well-crafted general questions about science and about scientists. And it was a really great exercise. So this is something I think I'm going to include going forward in this class and in other classes, even after we're no longer in Zoom.
Okay, that's the first one. And I will now bring up the second one, and then we'll have questions on the lecture and on the 2 videos. Okay, let me bring it up. I'm having trouble. Hold on. Okay, and now I'll go to share screen.
Hi, my name is Dave Paletti, and I am a senior instructor in the Department of Fisheries and Wildlife at Oregon State University. I've been teaching my course, Wildlife Behavior, for about closer to 8 years now at this point. So I've been doing it for quite a while. This is an exclusively online course. So unlike I know a lot of folks out there, this course is not something that was originally taught on campus and had to be very quickly repackaged in a way for remote learning. Now that was really difficult, so I'm quite lucky in that regard. Again, so more about my class. Again, it's called Wildlife Behavior. It's a 400 level class, 4 credits. We're on the term system here at Oregon State University, so that means the quarter system, 10 weeks. As you all know, there's an incredible amount we could cover on the subject matter, but I think I've developed a way over many quarters to deliver it all that the students seem to be retaining the information. They're interested. I keep them interested and I keep them entertained, while also conveying a lot of stuff that they've responded positively to. So this is a 400 level, so it's geared towards juniors, seniors most often. And that also means there's an expectation that they have a background in basic biology, ecology, and maybe even a little statistics. So they should come into my class knowing some of that basic stuff. This course, I use this textbook. It may be familiar to some of you folks here in the society. It's a primer of conservation behavior, and it's written by Drs. Blumstein and Fernandez-Jurisic. I like it because it has a lot of information about behavior and ways to actually apply it in a conservation sense. And students in our department, that's something they're looking for, how to apply what they have learned about the outdoors, science, nature, fisheries, and wildlife, and actually use it in a management scenario. So it's a great textbook for that. What I've learned over the years teaching this class and many others is something I've come up with called the 3 C's. And that's connection, content, and continuity. Without question, the most often thing students say to me at the end of the term on evaluations is how much they appreciate actually being able to see me and to hear me and to know that there's a person at the other end delivering their course. They don't, they don't respond very positively to courses that I've taught in the past that have just been me delivering reading materials or just, faceless, voiceless PowerPoint lectures. But when I get out there and I record little introductory videos of myself or if I give feedback on grades with my face and showing me gesticulating wildly about whatever behavioral concept I'm talking about that particular week, they seem to love it. So connection is a really big thing for learners online. That second C, content. It's important for me to deliver things in a way that appeals to multiple learning modalities. So I have the inevitable textbook readings, which I've showed you. I've got lectures done in Prezi, so those are very kind of a dynamic form of a PowerPoint lecture. I've got, little video clips and short articles that I read. So I appeal to a lot of, visual learners and people that love to read and listen. So I try to capture all of that to keep, to accommodate a little bit of everybody. And the third C is continuity. Online, I think it's very important for students to learn what to expect from week to week. So if you're somebody that has your course broken up into 1 week modules, which is very common for online learning, it's very important for a student to go in to each week and to click on, week 3 and see, okay, there's the lecture, there's the assignment for this week, there's a discussion board, whatever it may be, and know what it looks like and where it's going to be and where to navigate to next to turn everything in. So these are the 3 C's, again, connection, content, and continuity that I think make for a really successful class. I can talk a lot more about this, but I'm looking forward to hearing a lot more from you folks. I should mention I've had the opportunity to talk about this class in years past at Animal Behavior Society annual meetings, and I'm glad we get to do this once again. So I look forward to a really fun, engaging workshop. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you. Okay, now I'm going to turn it back to Doug. He's going to lead a discussion, and then we're going to distribute you into breakout rooms.
Yeah, so let me just tell you the organization here. I think to keep on time, we'll probably just save questions for me to the kind of the general discussion afterwards. But I think what we're going to do now is we're going to go into some breakout rooms. And then once you get into those breakout rooms, these are the things that you should do. So thanks, Andrea, for putting together this nice list of instructions for folks. Determine who's going to be a reporter from that breakout room. And if nobody volunteers, you can choose the person with the most recent birthday. It's a good technique. And then if you could consider some of these questions, of course, if you want to talk about something a little bit different, that's okay as well. How do you connect with your students in the online environment? How do you make a student-focused classroom? How do you make your synchronous online lectures interactive? And then how do you make those asynchronous recorded lectures engaging and interactive? And then how can you organize and facilitate, or how do you organize and facilitate discussions in the online environment? And then what we'll do is, if you're the reporter, just take a note of your breakout room number. And identify 1 or 2 compelling strategies or questions that 1 or more group members discussed, and then just be prepared to share back when we come back in about 15 minutes, and we'll have kind of a larger collective discussion. And I'll probably just open it up for people to share, and then if it kind of the conversation kind of goes down a little bit, I may call on specific rooms to report out. So that's what we'll do now. So if our host would like to assign breakout rooms, that'd be great.
Doug, can you copy and paste the content from this slide into the chat box for everybody before
I can. Let me do that right now. Give me a second.
And everybody, when we come back and we're having a group discussion, it really would be nice, like Doug asked, if everyone turns on their cameras so we see who you are.
Okay, I've shared that in the chat, and I believe the chat's that you can now see the chat box when you go into your breakout rooms.
So I'm going to send you into the breakout rooms now.
So I think we had some good conversations there in our breakout rooms, and like I said, I think we'll start. I'll just kind of open it up, and I'll flip on my participants tab here. And if anybody from one of the breakout groups wants to raise their hand in that participants tab and let me know they'd like to add something to the discussion, I'll call on you. Otherwise, I will ask a general group number to report out. Not seeing anybody raise their hand. You guys have that capability on your screen? Make sure that you do there. No. Okay. Well, then why don't I? Oh, I see a hand there. Andrew. Andrew Fulmer, do you want to contribute something and unmute yourself? And
Sorry, I forgot about the unmuting myself.
no problem.
I was a reporter for Breakout Room 5. Is that a pertinent? So we were talking about ways to kind of facilitate icebreaker, get students involved in conversation beforehand. There was a suggestion of starting up a discussion or slide potentially before, 15 minutes before, and allowing for answering of questions, perhaps fun questions unrelated to the central topic or any topic, or allowing for annotations of a slide or any visual interaction amongst students before class began. Shared Google Docs as ways to track progress and see if students are getting stuck along the way, see a real-time update of how they're responding to certain things and which students are engaged. Getting colleagues together to practice different online techniques so that you're familiar with different functionalities at the beginning or even during semesters. And tonic excitement, being expressive even on this, relatively this limited modality, being expressive, gesticulating, having interactive slides, allowing for the addition of notes. Those were our key themes.
Great. So I thought it was interesting that you mentioned that you practiced with some of your colleagues.
I did not.
So I'm curious, the group member that did that, what did that entail exactly? Did they give specifics, or maybe that person would like to contribute?
I think that was me. I actually have a standing happy hour with some colleagues on Friday afternoons that started as a way to keep ourselves sane. But because we're using the university's platform, which we're a Microsoft campus, so we're using Teams, not Zoom. We're using that for our happy hour. And so then when they introduce new functionality, or we just hear a new idea, like at a workshop like this, and we want to see if we can do it in Teams, we practice on each other. And I've worked a lot. The other thing I would say is talk to your IT people if you haven't done that, because they can be a wealth of ideas and understanding and so on. But often when I get together, we're just one-on-one with the IT guy, he controls the screen and says, oh, you click here and you do this and you do that and you do that. And I'm like, whoa, I couldn't even see it as fast as you were doing it, let alone take notes. And so either making him let me take control and doing it, or doing it, practicing on my friends, has been incredibly helpful.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent idea, and one that had not occurred to me, to actually practice this with the colleagues. I think we got hurled into this so quickly that we didn't have time to even think about what to do, right? And now that's the reason we're here, is to try to figure out where to go forward with this. So that's a really excellent idea. Thank you for sharing that. Christine Gurley, I see that your hand's up.
Hello, I was in room 11, and we spent a lot of our time talking about how do we make pre-recorded content interactive, and a little bit about online discussions. We did talk about several people had experience with what was previously mentioned in the whole group about having a pre-recorded lecture and then having an intro video where you either make a newer video where you introduce yourself or talk about the content or maybe emphasize some point. And then one thing we talked about in our group that several people had done was you have a follow-up synchronous component, that you have like an asynchronous lecture and then a synchronous discussion, or sometimes some people had partially in-person stuff, so they would have a group activity or a Zoom lecture where people had a discussion. And we had found that was really helpful to the students, and that the asynchronous content was very useful for students who had jobs or who didn't live on camp, who normally the flexibility was helpful, but that they really appreciated having an in-person follow-up section to go with it, that they expressed that was helpful. So that turned out to be actually good for discussion. And then
it seems like that's the kind of the best of both worlds, right? The students can kind of interact with that content at their own pace, but then they crave that interactive experience with the instructors. I'm sorry, I interrupted you. Go ahead.
No, you're good. I think we had two other things that I thought were interesting. One person, they talked about their department already had an intro class where multiple professors would make a recorded lecture and they would give it to the students before things went remote. And so they already had in place that same idea of recording an intro that was more recent and updating it. Even if you have an old, like the lecture content is pre-recorded, you can always make that first section newer so that it feels a little more authentic to the students. And then one other thing, when we were talking about online discussion groups and how to get students to participate in breakout rooms, because sometimes that was a little weird, especially if it was a big group with lots of different people who had never met. And one thing we talked about that it might be helpful, some of us had experience with this and some didn't, but that it might be helpful to assign the same students to the same breakout group the entire semester so that it was less weird for them and they were more likely to talk to each other in those breakout rooms.
Yeah, that's an interesting comment that you just made. And well, Sue, I promise I see you there. I'm going to come back to you. But I know that Chrissy was in our group and we talked about something very similar to that with the breakout room. So I'm going to hand it off to Chrissy Stanley.
Hi, yeah, we talked about quite a few things. I think one of the interesting things for me was about when you present these videos. So I think most of us usually present the video maybe a few days before or a week before the synchronous session. But one person said they get students to watch it at the start of the session. So they tell them to go and watch the video as the session starts. And that might be something that I'm going to try, because I do find that students don't watch the videos that I'm producing. I'm having a look at the numbers who are watching them and being really disheartened. So I might actually try that. But one thing I do with breakout rooms is I get them to use something called Padlet. So I ask them a question to then discuss in their breakout rooms, a problem to solve. But I ask them to post their answers onto a shared Padlet. And this means that everyone in the group can see what the different groups are discussing. And it gives them all the chance to contribute to the entire session. So that's something that might be useful for people. I'm not sure if there's anything else you wanted me to mention.
Yeah, no, thank you. No, and I think we also chatted a little bit just about how keeping those breakout rooms stable with the same people help to build a sense of community in the classroom. And normally I like to kind of move my discussion groups around so different people interact with different people in the class, but that's when they're in person and can see each other. And to try to build community is really important, right? So doing that by kind of having these set groups in the breakout rooms, I think is an idea that I'm certainly going to try. Okay, Sue, I see your hands up. I'll come back to you now.
Thanks. So I was in group 6, and we also focused on ways to make the asynchronous recorded lectures more engaging and interactive. And, a lot of the same comments that we've been hearing. Multiple shorter lectures seems key. I know that I have some colleagues who if they were in a 55-minute class, they recorded a 55-minute lecture, and that can be really overwhelming for students, especially when they're dealing with other time constraints. So shorter snippets gives students more flexibility, even though that might mean, in some cases, reducing the amount of content that you're able to cover. The idea of a flipped classroom where the lectures, the reading, is done in advance, and then you do a synchronous session where you're discussing is another strategy that seemed really important. A number of us used checklists or agendas to help students keep track of everything that had to be done during that module or that week. And I know the feedback I got from students was that was hugely helpful, and they really wanted that. Anyone else in the group has other points to add? I think we've all kind of been circling around the same basic principles, but those were some of the key points that we came up with.
Yeah, thank you for.
Yeah, the shorter videos. Yeah. Oh,
the shorter video thing. Sorry, I just very enthusiastically agree. I know when I first started recording these videos, I think we're all like this. We love the topic, right? At one point, I was giving my recorded lecture on behavioral neuroscience, and I looked down and I had been recording the lecture for like an hour and 15 minutes, and I'm like, what have I done? And I didn't go through as many slides as I would have normally done in person either. I just think I went into greater depth of detail, like I was having this unusual conversation with myself about the content or something. And I really had to put the reins on that and put these into kind of digestible chunks. And I think that's one of the most valuable lessons that I've learned as well. So I definitely appreciate you sharing that.
And can I just quickly add one thing? We didn't talk about this in the group, but I know, some of my colleagues would edit their videos, they would rehearse, they would script it. And I didn't do any of that. My feeling is if I'm in the classroom and I screw up, I just got to rethink and keep going. So I kind of used the same approach with recording the lectures. And I think that made it a little bit more real and not so much like I was like reading off of a script.
Yeah, I think that's a great point as well. It's funny. I know when I first started recording my videos, I would edit all the ums and ahs out, and I don't know why I did that. It was insane. And it's true. I think when you hear yourself recorded, right, you put yourself up to more scrutiny than you would in the live in class environment. So, okay, David, I see that your hand's up. Would you like to share?
Yeah, so I was recorder for group 1, and we touched on, I guess, some of the software packages that we use, and also on ways of ensuring participation. So people sang the praises of RStudio Cloud as being a really natural software to use, both in person, but even more so online in some cases. And I guess that we came from different universities that have different software packages, but Collaborate Ultra sounded like a great way of integrating everything in one place, including your video interaction with your students. And that allowed people to respond easily to chat questions that students had. And so sort of segueing into feedback that we could give to students, we had some people were using a method of just reading back students' questions to the whole class in real time. So that would kind of slow down the class a little bit, and then also create the sense that the instructor was really engaged with the students. So I think that that's something that follows through from in-person teaching as well, is that if you actively listen to your students and paraphrase their questions, they also feel heard. So another way of interacting is a software called Perusal, which is good for annotating different documents, and I think even videos, correct me if I'm wrong. And you can kind of see where people are writing the most comments, and that can kind of be like an equivalent of Think, Pair, Share, where you can actually see where students need the most emphasis. So we also talked about online discussion boards, and I think that everyone kind of had universally mixed experiences with those. Despite the fact that students sometimes request them, they are sometimes completely unused. So this may be something that everyone thinks is a good idea, including the students, but then doesn't actually happen. And incentivizing lecture participation during the synchronous portion of lectures seem to be really important across the board. So if anyone wants to add anything from group 1, then please do.
All right, well, thank you. Yeah, if you could, I know we're going to talk more about resources that we can use in online teaching and learning later today. But if you want to if you feel comfortable writing some of the names of the software and things that you guys talked about in the chat, I think that could be really helpful for other people to look those up, David. So thank you for sharing those. We just have a few more minutes left, and I see a couple of hands. So I'm going to jump to Teresa, and then we'll go to Dwayne, and then we'll take a quick break.
Hi, thank you. I was in group 8. A lot of what we talked about was already covered, but one thing that we concentrated on was sort of talking about synchronous classes and making them a little bit more interactive. So what was mentioned was using Zoom polls or even sort of questions that could be answered in a few words on your slides, and then having students put that in the chat just as sort of a
interactive tool.
Yeah, we talked about using polling in our classroom too, and I think, I think one thing for me is I'm going to try to take these things that we talk about here and bring them into my own class. It's like things that I've always wanted to do, but just didn't have the time to really integrate. And now, I've had to be really thoughtful about it. So I think it's nice to hear these things, and they're going to work in both the online and in-person environment. So thank you, Teresa, for that. Dwayne. Dwayne, you're muted.
Yeah, okay. I started to put my hand down because I wasn't the recorder for my group, but there were certain things that were said that I just wanted to say. First of all, I found it very good to keep individuals in the same group. When it was face-to-face, I would break it up. Sometimes they would stay together, and sometimes the groups would change. But, I think it's very important to keep them together in this environment. The other thing I was going to say that was brought up is that I found out that I could not effectively teach the same amount of material in online that I could face to face, and I was surprised. And I thought that was just me. I realized that I had to shorten the amount of information, make my PowerPoints more colorful, and have less information per slide. And when I talked to others in my group, others in my department, they said we had to do the same thing. So.
No, I think that's a really good point. And I've had the exact same experience. It's just, I think it's a lot because it's very, you try to make a recorded video interactive. It's difficult, right? So anytime that it's passive like this, you kind of have to pull it back a little bit. And I've certainly delivered less content. And initially, when the pandemic started, I kind of was just like, well, this is a result of the pandemic. But no, I think you're absolutely right. I think it's a difference between delivering material online versus in person, and the pacing and what the students can digest. And perhaps maybe this is a lesson for us. I don't know what others think, to maybe dial back some of the content generally in our in-person classroom. Maybe we are moving more quickly than we should be. And maybe that's something that we need to just think about and be cognizant of moving forward. Okay, well, that's a great discussion. I think we are at 15 minutes now. And correct me if I'm wrong, Eduardo, but I think we have a break now, right? A short break before the next one.
We do.
Yeah.
Okay, great. So why don't we take, what do we got for a break here? We have about a 5-minute break or so. Why don't we take 5-6 minutes to stretch out? And the sun has risen here in the West Coast, so I might go see if I can see the sunrise out the window, and then we'll come back for our next session.